So, welcome to lesson 4.3, which is about the life cycle of civilizations. And this lesson is going to be divided into 10 parts. So, we'll start by talking about the idea of civilizations as the theatre of history. In other words, the idea that civilizations are where history happens. And then we'll talk about a number of models of the development of civilizations. So we'll start off with what I'll call the Spengler-Toynbee model. And that will be in 4 parts. So we'll start off with Danilevsky, who's a Russian and a figure of the late 19th century. And then we'll move on to Spengler, who's a figure of the early 20th century and kind of built upon and elaborated Danilevsky's ideas. And then Toynbee, who's a figure of the early middle part of the 20th century, who was kind of a reaction to Spengler. And then Quigley, who's a figure of the late mid-20th century, who's tried to systematize Toynbee's ideas in particular and make them more scientific. So that's the Spengler-Toynbee model in 4 parts. And then we'll move on to some more idiosyncratic theorists. So this will be in 3 parts corresponding to 3 thinkers who are less well known and less influential, but are nevertheless of interest to us as theoretical historians to take a look at their ideas. So we start with De Ullifer, who's a early 20th century, and then Jim Penman and Hegel, who are both working into the 21st century. And next we'll talk about the nature of the interaction between civilizations. So civilizations are self-contained entities, but they can influence each other, and we'll look at theories about the nature of that influence. And lastly, we'll talk about barbarians. Who have been described as the dark twin of civilizations. So a civilization has a sense of itself as a distinct entity, as a civilization, because it's surrounded by people who don't belong to the civilization, people who are not civilized, the barbarians. So there's a division between the civilization, the civilized people, and the barbarians that surround it, the barbarian people. And there's always been an interaction between these two, between the civilization and its dark twin, the barbarians. And we'll be thinking about the theories about that. So in part 1, we're going to be talking about the idea of civilization as the theatre of history. So this means that it is civilizations where history happens, and that theories of history are theories about the evolution and development and life cycle of civilizations. And a sort of characterization of that view is associated with the words of the historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who said that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, doesn't really have a history. It's just, as he put it, the unrewarding gyrations of primitive tribes or barbarian tribes, uncivilized tribes. So what he was saying is that in these non-civilized areas, it's just an endless repetition of the same thing. It's not going anywhere. People just make their living in the same way, day after day, year after year, century after century. It's not leading anywhere, and it's not documented, it's not recorded, so there's no real change, there's no evolution to it, there's no history, nothing that we can call history. And as an example of that, we might consider, for example, in Papua New Guinea, where it's divided into tribal villages that are often fighting each other. So people from one village might go and raid another village, and then later on that other village comes and raids them back. But this just happens over and over again. It's just a feud, but it doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't change anything. One feud is the same as any other feud. There's no particular before and after to a feud. The situation afterwards is just the same as the situation before. And then we can contrast that with something like a war in European civilization, where we might take, for example, the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648, which ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, or some would say the Treaties of Westphalia. And this is attributed with producing new ideas about the sovereignty of states and introducing the concept of the nation state, which has then persisted down to the present time and characterizes the world today, so that it's an idea that's spread to other regions. So we have the United Nations, which is divided into nation states. There are about 220 nation states, so it divided up the whole world into nation states. So that idea came out of a European civilization war. And so that war, in this case, can be seen as a world historical event. It did change history. There is a definite before and after. And so the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia is a piece of history that we can study and interpret, not like the undocumented feuding and raids of uncivilized peoples. Well, this attitude was very much challenged by a book in the 1980s, 1982, by the anthropologist Eric Wolf, called Europe and the People Without History. Eric Wolf. And he was kind of being sarcastic with this phrase, the people without history, ironic. He was implying that this is a very Eurocentric view, that history happened in Europe, in European civilization, but in the rest of the world, uncivilized parts of the world anyway, these people lived without history. The purpose of his book was to show that, in fact, many of the ideas that came out of Europe had been brought into Europe from elsewhere. There'd long been an interaction between Europe and the rest of the world. So it wasn't the case that the rest of the world was just sitting around passively waiting to be discovered and taught by Europeans. On the contrary, when the Europeans went out into the world, they're in a way just bringing back to the rest of the world ideas that had come from that part of the world, perhaps improved and amplified, but nevertheless that, you know, were not entirely new to the people that the Europeans were encountering. And furthermore, he argued that in that interaction between Europeans and the rest of the world, those other peoples were active participants in the events that happened. So what came out of that was the result of an interaction between Europeans and other regions. It was not a one-way street where, you know, the Europeans discovered and then taught these other people, but the other peoples shaped through their reaction to the European incomers what happened, what grew out of that encounter. So it was, as I say, a two-way thing, not a one-way thing. So that's the argument of Europe and the people without history, that people who are not part of European civilization cannot be written off as not having a meaningful history. They very much did, and they are participants in the whole of world history. And so, you know, one implication of that then is that clearly other regions should not feel sort of humiliated or that, you know, everything seems to have been invented and discovered and explored by Europeans. That's not the case. They participated in all these things, and they're as much responsible for shaping the modern world. But the flip side of that then is, and though this may not be a point that Woolf himself emphasized, but the flip side of it is that conversely other regions, can't, well, if Europe can't take the credit for all the good things that happened in the modern world and that have created sort of the abundance and the technologies and knowledge that we have today, if Europe can't take all the credit for that, then similarly other regions can't put all the blame on Europe for the bad things that happened. So that would mean taking into account, for example, the role of Africans in creating the African slave trade and the role of Indians in creating the British Raj, for example. Now, what we're going to be doing in this whole lesson is looking at models of history that are framed in terms of civilization. So they do tend to take this view that it's only in the civilized world that history is happening. But as theoretical historians, we don't need to believe that. We're in fact interested in those more unchanging, repeating, cyclical patterns, that perhaps things that can only be studied through archaeology, but we also consider those. They're part of our broader understanding of social evolution through history or through time. And so in a way it's a kind of definitional matter that perhaps as theoretical historians we define history in a broader way. It's not just what happens in civilizations, it's all social behavior generally, and particularly social change generally is part of our area of interest. But some people define it more narrowly and would consider history proper as evolutionary change that's documented and therefore that tends to happen only in civilizations. So, as I say, those we'll be looking at theories of that kind, but we'll be bearing in mind that these critiques, and that actually we have a broader view, perhaps, that we'll explore in later modules than this focus on history in terms of just civilizations alone. So in the rest of this first part of the lesson, we'll consider some early theorists of civilizations and the history that happens in civilizations up to the 19th century. And we'll start with Augustine of Hippo. He was a Christian bishop, a theologian of around the year 400, who flourished. And he came from Hippo, which is a Roman city in what's today Algeria. And he had the idea that history is a struggle between the forces of evil and good. And the forces of evil are the material world, which he called the city of Satan, the city of the devil. And all good things are the spiritual world, the city of God. And he saw this struggle between evil and good, between the city of the devil and the city of God, as taking place within the Roman world, the Roman civilization, the Roman Empire. So there are your actors, the forces of evil and good. There's your plot. It's a struggle that leads eventually to the triumph of the city of God, and the theatre is the Roman world in which this drama takes place. And our next thinker is Ibn Khaldun, who's a figure of the 14th, 15th century, so around 1400 is when he was flourishing. And he saw the evolution of civilization as a series of dramas in different areas that went through several stages. So the areas he divided into the socio-economic side of life, the state, the evolution of the state, so political matters, then changes in cities themselves, then in a bit more detail, changes in the nature of the economy, and lastly the evolution of science, of knowledge. So, filling in the stages that Ibn Khaldun saw in each area. So, for Ibn Khaldun, a civilization was characterized by two things: cities, and we saw that earlier, that in the word civilization, the fact that it's based in cities is kind of implicit in the word civis for citizen, and has always been seen as an important part of civilization. And the other thing, as he put it, was that it has a great religion. So for Ibn Khaldun, Islam, but we might say an ideology more generally. We saw earlier in the previous lesson that a civilization is characterized by a super style, a world view, a philosophy, a characteristic outlook. And so he then said that it's what's going on in this civilization, defined by that, are these processes in these 5 areas. And I've put them here because there's an implicit ascent. So I put them this way up because there's an implicit ascent through these stages, but then each one kind of leads to an undesirable situation, and the whole thing collapses and starts again at the bottom. Or maybe I should put there, the bottom. And then just looking in more detail into each one. So in the socio-economic world, people start self-sufficient. Each person just, grows their food for themselves. But then there comes a division of labour. So there's the farmers, and then metal workers, say, and traders who produce or specialise, and through that they increase the scope and amount of activity in the economy, and people are better off. But then that leads to eventually excess production just for the sake of production, and it loses its logic, and the whole thing eventually collapses. In the evolution of the state, he saw that it starts off with people forming a strong community. So his idea of social cohesion, asabiyya, and then comes along an autocrat who's ruling over this community, but the ruling elite then tends towards selfishness. So instead of ruling for the benefit of the people, it now rules for its own self-interest. And then the elite starts to resist change in the society because it's interested in preserving its position. So it tends to make the society become stagnant. And then the elite moves on to just looting what's there, as now there's no sort of new production coming in. It's to continue to grow through its own greed. It's kind of being rapacity towards the society, just taking as much as it can while it can, and eventually leading towards the collapse of the civilization. And then in the evolution of cities, he suggests cities start off vigorous. They're places where there's an awful lot of activity going on. There's lots of ideas being generated. There's lots of trade happening. But cities become bigger. People become alienated from each other. They're, all mutual strangers, and they don't have any allegiance or loyalty to their fellow citizens, and so that leads to squalor and decay of the city. People, don't worry about keeping the environment clean. They are just concerned about themselves. They don't feel any connection to other people. So they'll just litter and not worry about the consequences. In the economy, particularly, then this is kind of dividing down into a few more stages, this division of labour. So it starts with the specialisation of the division of labour. But as there's a kind of limit to the amount of specialisation and the amount of extra value that can come from specialising, but as the population keeps growing, prices then start to rise. The state becomes involved in trying to regulate economic activity. So at first that's kind of desirable, about enforcing weights and measures and making exchange more rational. But that moves on to coercion, where the government becomes increasingly interventionist in the economy and obstructing economic activity. And that then leads to the decline of the economy and general poverty. And lastly, in science, he saw that civilization starts with a slow increase of knowledge. Then it moves on as the civilization becomes more established, to knowledge increasing more quickly. As people come into cities, they specialize. Specialization itself implies growth of knowledge, because you've got new specialist kinds of activities. So, when everybody's a jack of all trades and does everything for themselves, they don't know very much about any particular area. But when people specialize, they know an awful lot about particular areas. But then, as we're moving into the sort of decay and alienation and the rapacious elite, then the increase of knowledge slows down again. So for Ibn Khaldun, these are the dramas that are happening in civilization. And our next thinker is Giambattista Vico, who's a figure of the 17th, 18th century, so around about 1700 we can say he was active. And he's most famous for his book New Science, in which he presented his theory of history, theory of civilization. So he saw history in a civilization as going through three acts, which he called firstly the Age of Gods, which leads on to the Age of Heroes, and then that leads on to, we can say, the Age of Humans. So in the Age of Gods, he said, people live like beasts, like animals. They're just making their own living. They're subsistence farmers. They just live for themselves, and they're, each day is the same, each year is the same. And it's an age of gods because in that condition, people feel that they're ruled by the gods. So whether it rains for their crops is determined by the gods. So they're at the mercy of the gods. Their lives are buffeted around by the gods. And then though they move on to the Age of Heroes, which is when they're ruled by warlike aristocrats. So this is quite a time of violence, of these heroes, heroic aristocrats, who are now, according to Vico, overcoming monsters, he says. So what he means by monsters is the harsh brutality of this world, the people's brutality to each other. So with subsistence farmers, you're not just making your own living, but you're also providing your own social security and self-protection, because there's no police, no law. If somebody steals from you, your only recourse is to go and beat them up and steal it back. That kind of harshness is what is being overcome in the Age of Heroes. Also, the monster of the harsh world. So as you start to build cities, for example, you protect yourself somewhat from the elements, and you can have grain stores that are controlled by these aristocrats, so you're less at the mercy of famine, bad weather and the resulting famine. But then society moves on from that, he said, to the Age of Humans, which is where then the idea is that society is ruled by human-made laws. So it's not buffeted around by the gods, it's not imposed by heroic aristocrats, it's by the people in society itself deciding what is the best way for them to live, what are the best laws, what is fair and equal. So there's more social equality here. And he suggests that this is divided into two stages. Firstly, democracy, where the way that people should live is decided by kind of mob rule, to give it a most pejorative term, but faction against faction. People struggle democratically to decide what is the best way to rule, and it's the majority that will win out. So there's kind of an ongoing struggle between factions, and some people lose out if they're on the wrong side of popular opinion. But then that moves on to what he saw as the highest form of civilization, monarchy, which implies not a dictator, but really the opposite, a ruler who rules with consent and is a legitimate ruler, bound by social conventions and maybe even formal laws. And so the rule of society is now rational, law-based, so there's more protection for the individual and for minorities. And then he saw this as eventually collapsing and going back to a period of anarchy and the age of gods again. And our next thinker is Hegel, who's a figure of the 18th, 19th century, so round about 1800 we can think of him as being active. And he saw the evolution of civilizations as proceeding through 4 acts. So it begins with despotism, rulers who rule by their own rules and for themselves. And then that leads on to democracy, which is when the idea of personal freedom first comes in, the idea that people should have a say in how they are ruled. Then that leads on to aristocracy, where an elite emerges, but this leads to a struggle between the elite and the general populace. And out of that comes monarchy, where power is concentrated in a central political authority, but it's a rational form of rule, it's consensual rule, it's rule by, if not laws, at least habits and customs. And so he like Vico, he's seeing monarchy as the peak of civilization. He perhaps reverses a bit Vico's idea here that Vico saw democracy as leading into monarchy, and aristocracy is associated with his earlier Age of Heroes, whereas for Hegel it evolves out of democracy and is a step towards monarchy. And this, we could also see this as a bit of a kind of a reversal of Polybius's anacyclosis theory, which we considered in an earlier module, where it went the other way from monarchy to aristocracy to democracy. And then Hegel said that this despotism in his day was characteristic of Asia, so the Middle East and Far East, or China and India, which he saw as where civilization began, the beginnings of civilization, but hadn't moved on from there. And then these next stages he saw as occurring in Greece and Rome, so characteristic of Greco-Roman world, Greco-Roman society. And then monarchy he saw as appearing in Europe, monarchy as he defined it, this rational form of rule, and particularly in the Germany of his day. And what he emphasized then was that with monarchy, it guarantees personal liberties because it is a consensual rule-based form of government. So it guarantees personal liberty, which is somewhat different from the American revolutionaries' conception of monarchy. But we noticed that the American revolutionaries didn't talk of democracy but of republics. And so yes, monarchy for Hegel is the least arbitrary form of rule and the most rational and least oppressive form of rule. And our final thinker is Karl Marx, who's a figure of the 19th century, lived from the early 19th century to the late 19th century. And for Marx, history is a drama that proceeds from the state of primitive communism, 1 VE, primitive, to advanced communism. So primitive communism is for simple tribes who have an attitude that everybody's equal and they should share and share alike. And advanced communism is a future technological civilization where, again, everybody is considered equal and there's an attitude of share and share alike. And for Marx, history is how we get from one to the other, the world's movement from primitive communism everywhere to advanced communism everywhere. Or we could say this is prehistory and this is post-history. So this is how people started with very simple societies, family bands, and post-history is the when history is ended, it's reached its happy ending, and in between is history proper. The drama of history is how we, through struggles, we get from there to there. And for Marx, this history, this is divided into a number of stages characterized by different modes of production. And we saw these in an earlier module. And one of them is, for example, feudalism, and we're currently in capitalism in Marx's theory, and we're moving towards socialism and eventually this advance communism. And for Marx, in each stage, each act of the drama, if you like, it's driven by struggle between classes, class struggle. So the classes are the actors, and the struggle between them is the drama of history. And each stage then has the same structure. The struggle is the drama, and the actors in that drama are two classes. And so to take the example of capitalism, which was of course the one most in Marx's mind as he was living through it, capitalism leads to a differentiation, a division into a financial capitalist elite and the workers. So there are two fundamental classes, and there is a struggle between them, and that struggle eventually resolves itself into the next stage of the drama, which is socialism. And for Marx, there is a logic driving this forward. So capitalism, it itself appears as a solution to a previous unsatisfactory situation. So capitalism kind of comes in for good reasons. It improves economic efficiency and makes greater abundance for everyone. But it also, though, leads to this creation of this financial elite, and so economic inequality. And then that creation of economic inequality creates class consciousness as the workers realize, hey, we're falling behind here. These elites have far more than us. So it creates class consciousness, and that class consciousness and perception of inequality inevitably leads to this struggle, and this struggle inevitably leads to eventually a resolution in a better form of society, socialism. So for Marx, there is this inexorability driving the process forward. But for Marx, the plot is always the same. The theatre is world civilization. The plot is always the same at each stage. It's just the actors and the scenery that changes between these different stages.